Hello, I'm Andrew Schaap and welcome to Visions of Representation, a series of interviews with scholars in democratic theory that we've recorded as part of the Horizon-funded Redirect project. In these interviews, world-leading experts in democratic theory discuss their ideas about the shifting dynamics in practices of representation within contemporary political life. In this interview, I caught up with Professor Michael Saward at Friends House in London in October 2025. I began by asking Professor Saward to tell me about the political and intellectual milieu he was responding to in his article on shape-shifting representation.
The article was published in 2014, and in some ways it's a product of its time, I think. And there were two things going on in my mind, I think about 50-50 as an influence on the way the article was shaped. One was a problem in political theory, because I felt that there was too much emphasis in theories of representation on consistency of representative practice being a good thing, being kind of intrinsically good. So that's on one side, and we might go into that. On the other side were specific examples. So at the beginning of the article, I cite an article from an American newspaper describing practices of Mitt Romney, who of course was the Republican nominee against Obama in the 2012 US presidential election. And this editorial and many others at the time were very critical of Romney for being a shapeshifter, they used the term. And this was intrinsically seen as a bad thing. Now, of course, in the context of a US primary, we kind of expect that. Historically, we know this, because to win the primary for your party, you need to appeal, to become the candidate, you need to appeal to the base of that party. So arguably, you need to be a little more extreme sometimes, a little more definitive in your policies, speaking to that audience. When you become the nominee, you need to speak to the country at large. You need to win centrists, independents, maybe people from supporters of the other party. So you need a more generalized message, more centrist. And so it's no surprising in a way that somebody might be accused of being a shapeshifter, maybe partly because the structures of the electoral system push them that way. Other examples were also in mind. I remember reading a review of a biography of Nelson Mandela, which was applauding the fact that he had appealed to different audiences in South Africa at very different times in his long career, in prison and especially outside prison. Sometimes he would do this appealing to different audiences in different ways, using different cadence, different words, at the same time, almost within a single speech. And that was in the way his performance came across, his demeanor, the way he controlled himself, as well as in the words that he spoke and the audiences he sought to address. So there was this 50-50 thing going on. I think a real gap in the theory which mattered. I mean, having gaps in academic knowledge is no great thing in itself, but if the gap seems to be a serious gap, getting in the way of our understanding of how, in this case, representation works in the real world. And these compelling examples pushing in different directions as well. So the notion of shape-shifting representation really grew as a topic, and I wanted to explore it out of that mix. Yes. Machiavelli's The Prince is definitely an influence here. You don't want to be just a lion because you'll be outfoxed by foxes. You don't want to just be a fox because you'll be devoured by lions. In other words, a political leader needs to have that flexibility to present, in my language anyway, him or herself to different audiences in nuanced, subtle, strategic, different ways. That's not to be normative about it or say that it's a good thing or a bad thing. It's just a very understandable response to complex political contexts. But contemporary theories of representation have tended to box different types of representation and representatives, different roles. The notion of roles is so you will play the role of classically a trustee, where you look after the interests of your constituency, even if they don't agree with you sometimes. You kind of stand above the fray. Or a delegate, where you do what your constituency tells you to do, if you can figure out what they're telling you to do. So these kind of separate roles are set up. And it seemed to me that Machiavelli already had an insight hundreds of years ago that the conceiving of representing in the political sphere as separate roles doesn't do the trick. It's far too kind of static a way of mapping representation onto the world. So I try to push aside the judgment. Is inconsistency or flexibility in a political leader a bad thing necessarily? It could be a bad thing in certain contexts, depending how we look at it. But I wanted to push that prejudgment aside. Look at the dynamics, look at the practice, look at examples, and really to shift from this notion of relatively fixed roles, like a descriptive representative, trustee again, delegate again, and there's a long list of them in the literature. And instead of seeing them as separate roles that one might consistently play as a representative, to think about mixing and matching of those roles. How a political leader or a candidate, for example, might almost on the spot sometimes create kind of hybrid roles by bringing some of those supposedly separate roles together in one practice. It's not impossible, for example, and we do see examples of this, of political leaders who play both trustee, I'm above the fray, I will look after your general interests. That may be difficult sometimes because you and I may disagree, that trustee role. And the delegate, I am responsive to you, I watch very closely what you want, and that drives my actions. It is possible to combine those in a kind of hybrid performance, or enactment, if you like, of representation. So I'm perfectly happy if somebody wants to talk about there is this role that representatives sometimes play, there is that one, there is that one, there is that one. What's interesting for me is the potential and actual movement amongst the roles. In other words, the positioning becomes more important than the role itself, and the dynamics of movement and positioning amongst those roles. Think of, again, the kind of examples we talked about a moment ago, the Mandela example. President Lula of Brazil is another one who's been commented on over a long political career in trade union politics, then elective politics, then presidential politics, and judicial politics in his case as well, constantly shifting there. So positioning amongst different roles puts the idea of social positioning and its dynamic shifting character as a priority in the theory, responding to the practice, but in the theory. Over roles. So I sort of try to downgrade the notion of role because it has too much of a kind of fixed, static sense, it seems to me, as a political theory of representation. And in many ways it does not illuminate political reality sufficiently. So where I get onto in the article is talking about patterns of shape-shifting representation. Once you allow in the door the idea that there is this big gap in the theory around these static roles and so on that I've talked about, and then you've got politicians shifting the way they present themselves, the way they speak, the particular audiences they seek to address, and you can get sort of mixes and hybrids in that context. So very quickly, it seems to me, you need to talk about, different possible patterns of shape-shifting. And by the way, this brings the agency of the would-be representative, or in my language, the claimant to representation, firmly back into the picture. And we look at the choices about shifting, maybe the mistakes in shifting identity for different audiences that politicians and candidates sometimes make. So there's a table in the article that tries to express what some of these patterns might look like. And one of the main variations there is that sometimes you or me as a political candidate, for example, may not have much room for maneuver. We may have a solid constituency in our party base or something similar, which makes it very difficult ideologically or maybe rhetorically to move away from that base. And so, for example, I have a notion of shape confined. One of the patterns would be you feel the politician feels confined to speak, act, and present him or herself in a particular way because the circumstances don't allow much room for maneuver. At the opposite end of the scale there. You have the shapeshifter, him or herself, really, the one who has both an inclination to shift their message or shift their style of presentation, and crucially the opportunity to do that. Maybe there are different potential, say, using an electoral context, voter constituencies out there. They're not compatible with each other, but this candidate wishes to find a way to appeal to the different audiences and has the opportunity to do so. Maybe the ideology of their party or group is rather flexible and loose, and there are different factions, and there are opportunities to work those lines, rhetorically and otherwise, across those factions. So talking about shape-shifting representation, on one level feeds into the so-called constructivist theory of representation. That term can mean different things to different people. Sometimes I've preferred the word performative approach to representation, but the labels don't matter too much. But the constructivism really pushes in the direction of saying representation is a thing that is constituted or established through practice, through confinement, through shifting, through enacting or performing one's appeals to be seen as representative, to be seen as speaking or acting for an audience or audiences. So if we're looking at what is the possibility, what is the opportunity on the one hand, and what is the inclination of, say, a political candidate to shapeshift. And it can depend so much on context. There's a lot of contextuality here, deliberately, in the theory and in the commentary about it. So, for example, if you're a candidate in a large populous country which has strong regional and local identities, it might be a federal system, there might be linguistic and other differences between different regions. So in terms of the spatiality, when a candidate is literally addressing or literally being in and addressing a particular place, there could be a rural-urban split going on here as well. There is the opportunity for place to be not determinative, but really significant in their choices, to be consistent or to shapeshift, or to, more to the point, I think, push a part of their general appeal aside in order to appeal to this specific audience, say a small rural audience as opposed to a more liberal urban audience. So space matters, and again, in political theory, space and spatiality have tended traditionally, I think it's fair to say, a very general claim, but I think it's fair to say, have not played a role, kind of constraints of space and context. And the temporality as well, I think the same comment could be made about the passage of time and the impact that has on norms, practices, concepts like representation. So it may well be that you can choose your occasion. We used the example earlier of Mitt Romney in the context of US primary and then general elections. Well, that's a temporal sequence. It's a more simple one. There are more complex ones, I think. What you can get away with at one time will involve a different set of constraints, parameters and opportunities, how you present yourself, the kind of rhetoric that you use and so on, to another. So there are potentially other dimensions, but again, I was tempted by the spatial and temporal mapping out of these patterns of shapeshifting. So if we look at our present day, I mean, the article was published in 2014 again, so there's over 10 years. 10 years maybe is a long time in politics, and we seem to be in a different configuration. If we look at politics from Trump's America to post-Brexit Britain, the project that this interview is a part of is about democratic disconnects between leaders and citizens and perhaps other modes of disconnect. And there is a lot of worry that democracy, however we choose to define that exactly, is in trouble in lots of parts of the world. Who's it in trouble from? People will give different answers, but the rise of populism is one of them. So we could look at that. Say we look at the rise of populism through populist leaders through the lens of shape-shifting representation. And I think in some ways, this is not in the article, this kind of practice spinning from the article, but in some ways, populist leaders are shape-confined. They are not shape-shifters so much. They need to put a pretty consistent sort of appeal that these liberal elites are against you. They do not have your interests at heart. I am the genuine, authentic article. Authenticity seems to matter a lot around figures like Farage and Trump and others, both for themselves and commentators on them. So arguably, there may be some scope there for shape-shifting in this kind of language, but they tend to choose to be consistent in the shape, the face, the rhetoric, the appeals that they offer to their audience. If there's something in what I just said, it kind of goes to the point about let's be careful how normatively we evaluate the shapeshifter. Looked like a suspicious character to begin with, but if you put yourself in the position of the current British Prime Minister, for example, Keir Starmer still needs, arguably, to appeal to different party factions, needs to appeal to the country as a whole, needs to appeal to different regions who are under different sorts of pressures. He needs to shapeshift. Arguably, to be a Prime Minister or a President, you must have that capacity or develop that capacity or take advantage of opportunities while not losing credibility. This is thin ice. Yes, this is thin ice, and nobody said it was easy to be a national political figure or another regional political figure. So in some ways, just kind of trying to nail down that point, I think populism in a way underlines, the rise of populism kind of underlines why we should be wary of prejudging as perhaps undemocratic, perhaps immoral in some ways, or perhaps amoral in some ways, the shape-shifting representative. Because look at these consistent guys, the populists, very consistent in the messages, quite predictable in the messages, choosing not to shapeshift, even if they have opportunities. I'm exaggerating slightly, but I think only slightly. They, to my mind, are the ones who are troubling in terms of democratic norms. I think Trump in particular, but that perhaps is another story.